Hello, IMD 100. This is your instructor, Ross Johnson, and this week we are going to talk about Chapter 2 in your textbook, Visualizing Technology. This chapter is about application software. Today we are going to first identify different types and the functionalities of various business productivity software items. We are going to also talk about the types and functions of personal software. We'll go on to talk about how to assess whether a certain piece of software is compatible with your computer system. We'll talk about the various ways to get software. Once you get it, how to install, uninstall, and update that software. And finally, we'll touch briefly on the importance of cloud computing, which is a term we hear a lot of today. Business productivity software usually comes in what is called an Office suite. The most common Office suite is Microsoft Office Suite, of course, as we can see here in the left side. We've also got various competitor suites, a main one being the Apple Office Suite called iWork. Now, Apple's Office Suite has a lot of the same functionality as Microsoft. We'll get into what Pages, Keynote, and Numbers, what types of programs they are, but they are immediate equivalents of the Microsoft Office suite. We've also got additional competitors to the scene. Google Apps is one that is a free option. I've marked it here in green, and I'll do that throughout today's presentation just to show you what some free options are as far as software. We hear a lot about the prohibitive cost of software, but there are free options out there, and I want you all to be aware of as many free options as you can get, so you can take advantage of them. Again, the Google apps are free, and another competitor to Microsoft and Apple iWork is the OpenOffice suite. Again, a series of business productivity software that are used in most office settings. And with these programs, you'll be able to accomplish the majority of office bookkeeping and other managerial tasks. When we take a look at the functionality of the programs within these various office suites, we can see that, again, there are equivalents among the suites, programs that do basically the same thing. For example, Microsoft Word, Apple Pages, OpenOffice Writer, and Google Docs are all word processing suites from the various manufacturers. Microsoft Excel, Apple Numbers, OpenOffice Calc, and Google Sheets are also spreadsheet type applications from these office suites. So we can see that there are similarities between the products that they offer. Now, databases are not pieces of software that every office suite creates. Apple does not have a database management piece of software, neither does Google. So we have to rely on Microsoft Access or OpenOffice Base to deal with database manipulation. A word processor is used to create, edit, and format documents. Documents can also have images. Word and OpenOffice Writer are full-featured word processors that can be used to create everything from a simple memo to a complex multi-layered document. Pages for Mac is the equivalent word processor for Macs. Again, word processors have a number of tools and features for page layout that allow them to present complex documents. Spreadsheet applications are used to create electronic worksheets. Spreadsheets are made of rows and columns, and they're very flexible. They can be used for managing business expenses, payroll, and billing. Excel is the spreadsheet application made by Microsoft. Numbers is the iWork application, and Calc is the OpenOffice application, while Sheets is the Google Apps application. Spreadsheets software is very powerful, and by using functions like equations, they can dramatically transform and alter large arrays of numbers. And later in the semester, we'll get into what spreadsheet software, specifically Excel, can do. Presentation software is used to create electronic slide decks or presentations. This itself is a PowerPoint presentation that we're going through today. Presentation software lets you display facts, figures, and ideas on slides to engage your audience and give them something visual to focus on during a lecture or other presentation. The slides can have text, graphics, embedded video, embedded audio, animations, or any combination of the above. Templates are available to spice up your presentation, and these templates often have predefined colors, fonts, and layouts. Microsoft PowerPoint is, of course, the leader in the field, although Apple's iWork Keynote does very much the same thing. Apache OpenOffice uses Impress, and Google Apps presentation software is called Slides. Finally, we can talk about database applications as far as business software. Database programs are similar to spreadsheet programs, but they are specifically for creating and managing databases, collection of records that are organized into a table. So less financial and bookkeeping applications and more record keeping and list making applications in these database applications. The records that are in the table of the database application contains information about one single person or one single product. So each record has fields such as name, address, product identification number, those sorts of attributes. Again, Microsoft has Access as one of the primary database pieces of software, and OpenOffice has what they call Base, and there is no database software for either Apple iWork or Google Apps. Now let's dig into some other types of business software. Financial software like QuickBooks, FreshBooks, Quicken, or Sage 50 are slightly more full-featured and can be used to do more complex calculations than basic Excel or other spreadsheet software. They can keep track of all business expenses from inventory to payroll, anything that might be necessary for a business and its operating. Moving on to other business software, document management software such as SharePoint, Dropbox, Google Drive, Alfresco, or OnBase help keep documents in the right hands of all the required individuals. They ensure that the versions of files are up to date within the system and that all users who access those files have current versions. So in large operations where documents are passing electronically through many hands across many desktops, these pieces of document management software help keep everyone's files and records complete and up to date. Again, in the spirit of naming free options for you to use, Google Drive is free to sign up for and a free file management, document management piece of software that you can use today. project management software such as Microsoft Project, Zoho Projects, Teamwork Projects, Basecamp, or Liquid Planner are, again, highly competitive pieces of software used in business contexts. They help keep projects on track and on budget while monitoring expenses and resources. They help project managers essentially do their job. Now we're going to dive into some uses of personal software. One common brand of personal software is financial software. They can help you keep track of bank accounts, monitor investments, create budgets and balance budgets, and export financial information to a tax preparation company or piece of software. One, again, that is free is Mint, made by Intuit. And this is a website where you can go online and enter account information. Again, a certain degree of trust is required here in order to share this account information, of course, securely through their site and using encryption. But what that will allow you to do is track your finances over time. And again, the service is free. You are paying for it with a certain extent with your data. So Mint is paying attention to maybe not your specifics, but your data in general. Again, all of that, those details can be found in the terms of service, which you agree to when you sign up for a service such as Mint. So it's important to remember that while software might be free on the surface, at least in the fact that you don't pay for it, you do end up paying one way or another with your data, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Tax preparation software, very similar to financial software, will help you file your state or federal income tax. And again, there are free options. The IRS has a free electronic file option where if your taxes are simple enough, that free option will be sufficient for you. And when it comes to more complex tax filings, then you get into the need for a paid service. So please look into those services carefully, because some of them will present themselves to you as free, but mislead you into thinking that even complex filings can be done for free, when that's not the case. So check carefully into what the terms are before you sign up and enter a lot of information into one of these tax sites. I know from experience that you don't want to have to redo this. There are entertainment and multimedia consumer-grade pieces of software that are used for entertainment, but also for industry. Video and photo editing software, for example. Adobe Photoshop, GIMP, Photor, and Paint.net are some popular photo editing pieces of software. Photoshop, of course, being probably the most well-known and the most popular, although it is also the most expensive. They allow you to perform basic functions, transformations on photographs like editing, cropping, or straightening an image, but they can also apply complex transformations and really change what images look like. And again, in the name of promoting free software, GIMP is a free, very full-featured photo editing software similar to Photoshop, but again, entirely free. In the same vein, video editing software is very popular nowadays. Adobe makes a popular version called Premiere. iMovie, on the other hand, comes free with your Mac and the Mac OS operating system. And some other popular video editing softwares are Lightworks and Final Cut Pro, which is for Mac only. Again, these allow you to transform video much in the way that the photo editing software allows you to transform photographs. You can address the video and audio qualities, splice, trim, and apply special effects to video. Now, these are sort of becoming pieces of software of the past. Recently, we learned that Apple was actually deprecating or retiring its Apple iTunes media management software in favor of splitting out its functionality into various pieces. But for a long time, iTunes reigned supreme on both Windows and Mac, and Windows Media Player seemed to be a distant second as far as media management software. And what this software is for helps keep track of multimedia files, meaning music or videos. These files are typically stored locally, and while this was a popular organizational scheme and file ownership scheme of the last 10 to 20 years, I would say, was the heyday. Nowadays, with the rise of streaming services, like those mentioned below, Apple Music, Spotify, Pandora, and Basecamp, and the transition of folks no longer owning the digital copies of their files, but streaming them through a subscription model, through a service, media management software like Windows Media Player or Apple iTunes have become less important over time. In the vein of streaming, not only do we have music streaming apps like we mentioned previously, but content streaming and video streaming applications. Like, I'm sure you're very familiar with Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, or HBO Now. Just a few examples of some of these streaming services out there. Again, these are streaming versions, so the actual content is not on your physical device, nor do you own that content, as you might own a DVD or even own a digital copy of a file. These streaming services only operate when they are connected to the internet. So that is both positive. You don't have to store large amounts of files, gigabytes upon gigabytes going into terabytes of video files, which can be very large to store. But on the other hand, you have the downside of needing typically a high-speed internet connection in order for these services to function. An additional benefit of a lot of these services in the modern era is they're device agnostic. This means that software like Netflix or Hulu can be used on many different devices. Your computer, your Apple TV, your Amazon Fire Stick, your Google Chromecast, your smart TV itself, a tablet, a smartphone. The list goes on as far as the different devices you can access this content from. Of course, there's a plethora of other educational and reference programs, software to study, plan, and design really anything of interest that you might have. Trip planning software, for example, genealogy software is very popular, as well as home and landscape design software for consumers are all available. These pieces of software might be less fully functional, less full-featured than business-grade, enterprise-grade versions, but again, they're much cheaper than the enterprise versions, more accessible for a consumer, and easier for an average Joe like you or I to buy, rather than investing what can be significant sums of money in enterprise-grade software. We're going to dive quickly into assessing software compatibility based on the specs of your computer, the specifications. On Windows, seeing the specifications of your computer is fairly simple. The system specs are the hardware and software information about a computer system. On Windows, if you go to File Explorer, this window here on the left, and if you right-click on this PC, you will be able to, in the context menu, select System, which will show you this information about the computer. It tells you what operating system is installed. In my case, this is Windows 10 Pro. It talks about which processor the computer has. This is, again, an Intel processor like we spoke about last week, one of the common microprocessor manufacturers. This is a Core i7, and the speed at which it operates, 2.6 gigahertz. So these give you just a few benchmarks to compare the performance of any given computer. It also talks about RAM, this computer having 8 gigabytes of RAM. It is a 64-bit operating system, which we're not going to go into necessarily as far as what it means, but it is important to note that operating systems come in either 64 or 32 bits. And when you choose one of those bit systems, you need to stick with it. So if you are running a 64-bit operating system, it is important to install the 64-bit versions of, say, Microsoft Office Suite or any other piece of software you might be using. Finally, if we get down here to the bottom, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, this talks about the license status of the operating system, Windows, on this computer. Windows is activated. Sometimes you'll see in bootleg copies of Windows or on counterfeit computers, Windows is not activated. It will still function, but it will display warning messages to that extent. And it's important when it comes to software licensing that the software is indeed activated to prove that you've paid for it and that you have earned the right, essentially, to use that software. On a Mac, if you click About this Mac in the upper left-hand corner, you can see system information, which provides, again, specific information about that computer system, about that Mac, just as System Info talked about that Windows PC. There's a number of different tabs in system information on a Mac. The Overview tab, of course, talks about the operating system itself, this version being Mojave version 10.14. It talks about the model of the computer itself. This is a MacBook Pro 15-inch, and the year it was manufactured. It talks about the processor, again, 2.6 being the speed of the processor in gigahertz, and gives us a benchmark to compare that processor to other computers. This computer has 16 gigabytes of RAM. If you remember, the Windows PC from the previous slide had 8. And if we go over here to storage, we can take a look at what the storage device is on this laptop, a 250 gigabyte flash storage drive. System requirements. They are important when it comes to installing software to make sure that the computer that you have is powerful enough to run the software that you would like to install. System requirements refer to the minimums that the computer must meet to run a specific piece of software. If you exceed those minimums described, usually you'll get better performance out of the computer. System requirements for software are usually described on the package or the web page of a piece of software. Now, it's important to note, as far as distribution of software, it's important that the mode of delivery of that software is compatible with your computer. A lot of older software came installed on a DVD, which of course required a disk drive. And while desktop computers still are common to have disk drives, laptops or even some other desktop computers no longer have DVD drives. So if that's the case, while they are relatively inexpensive to buy an external DVD drive to plug into your laptop, it's important to note that that might be a possibility, the need for a DVD drive to install a particular piece of software. Of course, this problem is mostly moot nowadays because a lot of software is downloadable online and can be installed simply from that downloaded file. That installer, which we'll get into what that looks like on Windows and Mac shortly, that installer is a digital version of that installed DVD that we used in years past. Here's an example of the requirements for a piece of software. In this case, the Windows 10 operating system. This graphic explains what a computer needs to have as far as minimum requirements to run Windows 10. And these requirements are fairly bare bones. A processor needs to be 1 gigahertz or faster. And if we recall, the computers on the two previous slides had processors that were about 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz. In order to run, Windows 10 also needs 1 gigabyte for a 32-bit version of the operating system, or 2 gigabytes for a 64-bit version of the operating system of RAM. And if we recall, the computers on the previous slides had 8 gigabytes and 16 gigabytes of RAM, respectively. Windows 10, again, needs a 32 gig hard drive or larger for storage. We could have looked at the system specs for the Windows PC or the Mac to see if it had enough storage to be compatible to meet the requirements to install Windows 10. And again, the list of requirements goes on. So it's important when evaluating compatibility to see that your system, your computer, meets all the requirements necessary to run a specific piece of software. Now let's dive briefly into some different methods of obtaining software and different schemes for purchasing and distribution of software. When it comes to software licensing, a proprietary license is a popular scheme for licensing of software. It grants the use of one or more copies of software, but ownership of those copies remains with the publisher, not with the user. So a lot of commercial software will use this licensing scheme. It tends to be rather restrictive as far as how you distribute, how you obtain the software, and even how you install it. So a lot of this licensed, proprietary licensed software will allow you to install it, but even before running the software, it will require a license key to activate that software. And this will help keep the software from being bootlegged or counterfeited, and will lock down the users only to those who have paid for the software or have otherwise been able to obtain a key. Some examples of proprietary licensing schemes come with electronic medical record programs. This is not consumer grade software, this is business grade, often found in hospitals like UK Hospital, but the example remains the same. Popular vendors like eClinicalWorks or Epic Systems sell licenses for their software. After it's implemented and installed at a site like a hospital, the site must continue to pay licensing fees in order for the software to keep working. So it provides the software publisher, the business, with a way of essentially making money, continuing that revenue stream. The drastic opposite of proprietary licensing is open source licensing, which grants ownership of the software, that copy of the software, to the end user. Typically, this means that the source code, the contents of the program are freely available and open on the internet, and that the user of that software can modify the code for their own purposes, and they can redistribute it typically with that same license. For example, many of you all use Google Chrome, but you might not know that Google Chrome is based on an open source browser platform called Chromium. Now, Google themselves released their source code for the Chrome browser as the Chromium project. But basically, it allows for web developers and even average folks like you and I to create add-ons and modify the browser, basically changing the experience and developing Chrome, all for the name of improving Google Chrome's functionality. It's rather ingenious that Google has managed to create an open source version of their software, which encourages folks to engage with it and work with it. When it comes to software purchase and distribution paradigms, we have several types of purchase schemes. Commercial software, which can be expensive, is sold either with a one-time retail model or subscription licensing model. And then again, we get back into the open source software purchase paradigm, which can range from freeware to shareware, donationware, or even freemium versions. Again, this typically requires no fee, although some fees can be involved depending on the exact scheme, and that source code is open. So for example, we talked before about the business software Apache OpenOffice. That source code is open and freely available, and that makes that Office suite available for folks to transport it on Windows, to export it to Mac, and even to Linux operating systems, if some of you all are familiar with Linux. Again, talking about software purchasing, retail software purchases are a one-time purchase. Once you buy it, technically you can use that software in perpetuity from that point onward. Of course, this is presupposing that your computer will last that long, and sometimes this will cause problems. Software that you buy once might no longer have updates, whereas the operating system that your computer runs will update. So eventually there becomes an incompatibility between the software, which is obsolete and unsupported, and the operating system, which remains current. Some examples of this retail pricing scheme: Microsoft Office, the standalone client version, that is, Adobe Photoshop, and more specifically Adobe Creative 6, Adobe Creative Suite. Adobe released its software in retail versions up through version Creative Suite 6. And then after that, in more recent years, they've moved to a subscription model, Creative Cloud, which we'll talk about. That model of subscription software purchasing involves a monthly or yearly fee paid by the user. As long as they pay the fee, they continue to have access to the software. If they lapse in payments, they may not be able to access their software, they may not be able to see their files. Microsoft Office also has a version of their Office suite that is a subscription model. That's Office 365. Adobe has a version of their Creative Suite that's a subscription model, and that's called Creative Cloud. On the other hand, freeware software is drastically different. A user can download and use freeware at no cost for an unlimited time. There is a downside to freeware because even that's too good to be true at times. While the software might not require payment to use, there might be other ways that you pay, if not with money, but with data, with private information, while using the software that the software developer or manufacturer might gather from you. If you've heard the term, there's no such thing as a free lunch, that comes into play here. Even though software might appear to be free, on the surface, you still could be paying in one way or another with your personal data when you use a piece of software. Shareware is a purchasing scheme where a user can try software before they buy it, usually for a trial or limited period. Of course, the downside of this is that a trial sometimes has limited functionality, not the entire functionality of the software. Sometimes it will put a watermark or some other sort of label on the finished product showing that this was a trial version, made with the trial version. Donationware is a purchasing scheme where software is free to use, but the user may make a donation if they like to the software developers. Of course, this is an unorthodox scheme, and it can lead to problems too. Developers who don't earn enough through donations may let their developing lapse. They may lag behind. They may determine that they're not earning enough revenue from that particular product, so they're going to ignore it or slack on it. So software that users rely on, if it's not supported through donations, may eventually go dormant. Finally, freemium software payment model means that the software itself is free to use, but in order to remove ads, for example, or pay for or achieve full functionality, the user must pay. And a lot of apps these days, as far as apps for your smartphone on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store for Android, are apps that are free on the surface, but in order for full functionality, or in order to remove ads, or in order to speed up gameplay, for instance, very popular with games, you must pay for that enhanced experience. Let's now dig into how to uninstall, install, and update software. Installing software on a computer copies files to that computer. It may also change settings and create folders in order for that software to have essentially a home on that computer. When a program is no longer used on a system, it needs to be uninstalled. Uninstalling removes all files, folders, and settings associated with that program. And finally, updating. Regular releases to a program can fix security holes with patches. They can address bugs that a software might have. They can add new features, improve compatibility, or, with a game, increase the levels. These updates are very important, especially in the modern era of malware and malicious software. Updates are important to keep your computer and your operating system and your data intact and safe. On a Windows computer, installing software is fairly easy. You will download what is called an installer, typically a .exe file, and we'll talk about file extensions next week. But a .exe file is an executable file. Most installers are called setup, and you'll know that you have an installer either by downloading it from a reputable website or by inserting an install DVD. Once you run the installer, you'll see a security warning like this. This window is there to prompt you to think twice about what you're about to do, about what your software you're about to install. Basically, it requires admin credentials, meaning a second level of credentialing in order for you to prove you want to do this to your computer. In this case, you want to install this software to your computer. It's important whenever you see this window not just to click a button, but to think about what it is that you're trying to do, what it is you're trying to accomplish, and if you would like significant changes to be made to your computer, because that is exactly what happens when you install a program. On a Mac, the installer comes in a disk image format. Here's the installer for Google Chrome, for instance. The disk image has a .dmg file extension at the end of it. So that's how you recognize an installer on a Mac. Once you open that disk image, typically another window will appear like this, showing the app itself and prompting you to drag it to your applications folder. That is the very simple, very basic gist of installing a piece of software on a Mac. When it comes to uninstalling software, on Windows, you need to go to Settings and then go to the Apps. These, again, are screenshots from Windows 10. Once you go to Apps and Features, you'll see a list of all the apps installed on your computer and the date they were installed, as well as the amount of space they take up on your system. If you select a particular piece of software, you can then select Uninstall, and a wizard will run to fully uninstall and remove the software from your computer. On a Mac, uninstalling a piece of software is maybe even simpler. All you have to do is find the intended software in the Applications folder in Finder, take that piece of software and drag it, or right-click and bring up a context menu to delete it by moving it to the trash. Once it's moved out of the Applications folder into the trash, that piece of software has been uninstalled on the Mac. So even simpler, no wizard or steps required, just move that piece of software to the trash. Updating software is very important, as I mentioned, in today's modern era, and updates need to come through reputable sources. The operating system, for instance, will prompt within itself for updates. Here's what updates look like on a Windows system. You can see that within Settings, part of Windows itself, the update is downloaded and notified. Similarly, on a Mac, within the Apple App Store, there is an Update tab and notifications of all relevant updates to that computer and that operating system. These updates are found through legitimate means, the Settings or the App Store. They are not found simply while randomly browsing the internet or as a pop-up while you're on your browser. These types of pop-ups are insidious and very common, and they are a way for malicious actors typically to get malware onto your system. Software will only prompt you to update itself through the software interface itself, not while you're browsing the internet. So for example, if you're Googling for your bank and suddenly you see a window pop up in your browser that says your operating system is out of date or Flash Player is out of date, think twice about whether or not that is a legitimate request
or whether that might be a malicious actor attempting to install malware on your computer. Pay attention to where the updates are coming from before you pursue them. We're going to dig briefly into cloud computing. Basically, cloud computing is a new paradigm for how software is installed and where it runs. The typical format for many years has been client-based software. This is software that's installed on a physical computer. The client, in this case, is the computer itself. So it might be your laptop, your desktop computer, something local and close by. Locally installed client-based software usually has more features, and the interface that's available for that software is dedicated to that software, meaning windows look exactly how developers want them to, and interfaces can be customizable and highly unique because the software runs on the operating system, meaning developers have a lot of flexibility as to what they can present to the user. Another feature in this case of client-based locally installed software is it's not reliant on internet connectivity. You can run client-based software without connection to the internet, and that's a huge plus. But on the flip side, typically the user of client-based software uses it in a standalone fashion. It's used in isolation, and very rarely does it have a collaborative element. On the other hand, this collaborative element is very common in cloud-based online software, and you'll see software suites like Google Docs and Google Drive, which are built around collaboration and file sharing. And this is a form of software that has become possible only in the internet age and only through cloud-based online software installs, or implementations rather. I say implementations rather than installs because no installation is typically necessary for cloud-based software. You simply open your browser, navigate to a website or a URL, and run the software. The software on a website through a browser typically has a simpler interface, which makes them easier to use. They also become more accessible when they're available through a browser. More computers typically have internet browsers installed, which becomes a portal through which you can use your software. However, if you were dependent on a client-based piece of software, you would have to go to a computer which had that particular piece of software installed on it. If you used cloud-based software, any computer with a browser can become a place for you to use that software. So, again, strengths and drawbacks to both types of software schemes. What cloud computing does, in a nutshell, is take that processing, take that software off of the system, off of the premise, off of the computer in front of you, and puts it in the cloud. Cloud service providers are companies that deliver these services. Here's a graphic to explain the difference between on-premise or local installs of software, comparing that to varying levels of removing resources from on-premise and moving them to the cloud, this orange. So we can see that the first level, infrastructure as a service, takes the infrastructure, the networking, the storage, the servers, and even the virtual machines that would typically be on-premise and moves those to the cloud, meaning they are now available on the internet. If we implemented that here at BCTC, for instance, our servers would no longer be here at BCTC, but they would be hosted somewhere online. And of course, this means they do have a physical presence somewhere, but it could be far off, halfway across the country or even across the world, depending on where those server farms are located. However, infrastructure as a service runs the middle ground. So while the servers and the foundational level architecture is hosted off-site, a lot of the user-facing software, like the application itself, is still hosted and managed on-premise. And as we move through platform as a service and finally software as a service, we see that more and more of the elements of the software, all the way from the foundational server that hosts it, all the way through to the application itself that you or I might use and interact with, becoming more and more hosted in the cloud, until you get to software as a service, where every single element of that software is hosted online. It might help if you think of it this way. Take a look at this slide. It's not talking about software, but it's talking about making pizza. If you think of a traditional on-premise deployment, when you're making pizza, everything, every element of the pizza production is in-house here with an on-premise deployment. Everything that goes towards that final finished product is located on-premise. As you move through infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, more and more of these elements of the production process get moved from your purview over to the vendor purview. As we see from infrastructure, the fundamentals are still managed by us, but the vendor will manage some elements as well. The vendor manages more elements with the platform as a service, and finally with software as a service, every element of software from foundation to end product is available online through the cloud. Infrastructure as a service, again, is using servers in the cloud instead of purchasing and maintaining servers on site. What's the benefit? It means that a business has reduced costs for hardware and software and personnel to support that equipment. So it takes costs and moves them off-site. Platform as a service provides a programming environment to develop, test, and deploy, meaning send out and make available to consumers of web apps. This gives businesses the ability to build and deploy and manage software as a service applications. So platform as a service makes collaboration easier and requires less programming knowledge than traditional programming tools. Finally, software as a service involves the delivery of applications over the internet, known as web apps. So, for example, Google Drive and Google Docs, the Google Office suite that we talked about at the very beginning of today, are completely web-based software as a service implementations. This is probably the most visible to the end user and what you will be most familiar with. So what do we need to do for next time? By the end of today, which typically if you're watching this will be Wednesday, September 4th, make sure that you have finished the Chapter 2 IT Sim, which should be in My Lab IT in the course calendar. By this time next week, on Wednesday, September 11th, make sure you've read Chapter 3 of the e-text, which is about file management, and complete the Chapter 3 IT Sim, also on file management. And after next Wednesday, we're going to implement some quizzes. Again, these are online. They should be fairly simple, and you'll get multiple tries to take them and complete them. so multiple chances to get 100%. The way that this will work is I will open the Chapter 3 quiz after Wednesday. So going into Wednesday, you'll read Chapter 3, you'll complete the IT sim. Wednesday during class, we'll have our lecture on Chapter 3, and then after Wednesday, after class, just to recap and solidify everything that you've learned, we'll have our VizCheck quiz, which will double check that you have learned and solidified what you've learned in class. And that quiz will also show up in MyLab IT on the assignment calendar. It will be available starting that Wednesday, September 11th, and will be available until Sunday, the following Sunday. So that gives you half of the week to take those 2 short quizzes. I believe they're 5, no more than 10. I think it's 5 questions each. So it should be short, sweet, and a good gauge of your understanding of Chapter 3. Thanks, and we'll talk to you next week.